Right. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second lecture of the, the 224th season of lectures of the Royal Philosophical Society of Glasgow. First of all, the usual announcement: if the fire alarm goes off, please leave either through the door at the back, the two doors at the side, and get yourself out onto the men's union or something like that. The other thing is, please switch off your mobile phones. You don't want to be the person that everybody looks at halfway through the lecture when suddenly we discover what your ringtone is. So please either switch them off or put them to silent. Thank you. Tonight we've got Professor Daniel Susskind to talk to us. You'll have seen on the green page his current jobs, and I say jobs in plural. And in a way, I think we're very honored and almost quite surprised that in the number of jobs and hats he wears, he's found time to come to Glasgow to address the society. He's authored two books on the impact of technology, the first jointly with his father, Richard Susskind, who happens to be a graduate of this university, on the future of professions. And this provoked hard thinking, discussion, and even grief in legal and other professions. As a director of a huge international management consultancy company commented, they demolish each profession's faith in its immutable uniqueness. Instead, they trace the inexorable and universal forces that will drive disintermediation, deconstruction, and disruption. So that's quite a mouthful. In his second book, A World Without Work, Daniel argues that we haven't woken up yet to the impact, the future impact on work of the current wave of technology's ability to perform a huge and surprising range of tasks. And currently he's expanding and developing that thesis in his next forthcoming book, What Should Our Children Do? How to Flourish in the Age of AI, advocating change, including to universities. Professor Susskind's writings are clear, engaging, and wide-ranging, and these are evident in his latest study on growth. Growth is in the news every day. The Chancellor tells us on numerous occasions, when she's not talking about the other two words that I won't mention, that are her two most favorite words, but she says economic growth is the #1 mission of this government. So there's been endless debate on growth, its lack of it, and what it's about. And tonight, Professor Susskind is taking us behind that as he addresses a society on growth, a reckoning.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that warm introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be with you all this evening. Tonight, I want to talk about growth, a reckoning, and I'll talk for 45 minutes or so, and then I think we have half an hour for me to hear some reflections and take some questions as well. So as I talk, please do jot down or make a note of anything that comes to mind. And I want to dive straight in. 3 facts, simple but really remarkable, have defined the economic history of human beings until now. The first is that essentially for the entire 300,000-year stretch that human beings have been around, economic life was essentially stagnant. So whether you were a hunter-gatherer slaving away in the Stone Age or a laborer working away at the start of the Industrial Revolution, although your lives would have differed in lots of respects, fundamentally, from an economic point of view, your life would have looked remarkably similar. A relentless, unforgiving struggle for subsistence. The second economic fact is that it was only very, very recently that this stagnation came to an end. Modern economic growth this is growth that is both significant and sustained, began just 250 years ago. And the third extraordinary fact is that somehow we have managed to maintain this economic ascent. Whenever growth had happened in earlier centuries, it had been limited and quickly fizzled out. But this time it was both significant and sustained, as if some long pent-up productive power had finally been unleashed. And the first part of the book that I wrote recently, it was mentioned before, Growth, explores this extraordinary escape, why we didn't have growth for so long, why it suddenly began, and how somehow we managed to maintain this ascent. Now, as time has passed, we've used this extraordinary material prosperity to achieve a whole variety of remarkable outcomes, freeing billions from the struggle for subsistence that haunted our ancestors, making the average human life far longer, far healthier than ever before, funding discoveries that have transformed our understanding of the world, splitting the atom, cracking the genetic code, starting to explore the stars. But it's also increasingly clear that this pursuit of prosperity has come at an enormous price. The destruction of the natural environment, the desolation of local cultures and communities, the emergence of vast inequalities between those who have a share in this extraordinary prosperity and those who do not. The creation of new technologies like artificial intelligence with disruptive effects on work and on politics, it's not clear yet we can properly control. And so growth presents us with a dilemma. On the one hand, it's associated with many of our greatest triumphs, but on the other hand, it's also related to many of the greatest problems that we confront today. And second part of the book is all about this dilemma, setting out the extraordinary promise of growth. Again, this idea that it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but also this extraordinary price as well, that it's behind many of our greatest challenges too. What I want to do this evening, though, is put the escape and the dilemma to one side, and I want to explore some other themes with you. The first is I want to explore how it was that growth became, exactly as you heard just in those introductory remarks there, how it became the sort of priority that it is today. I then want to turn to what I think is one of the most common, one of the increasingly common responses to the price of growth, which is an idea called degrowth, that what we ought to do, given this growth dilemma, is to actively press pause on growth or even go into reverse. And what I'm going to argue is that I think this would be one of the greatest acts of self-harm that humankind could inflict on itself. I'm going to agree with our Chancellor that we desperately want more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe. And I want to spend a little bit of time exploring the surprisingly little we know about the causes of economic growth. But I'm also going to argue that if we simply plow on ahead in the pursuit of ever more growth, we're going to be repeating the mistakes of the past. And that the only way we have to resolve this dilemma, this growth dilemma, is to pursue a different type of growth. And I want to say what that might look like and how we can do it. And finally, in the closing moments, I want to set out what we do if we can't change the nature of growth and some of the big challenges that we face in that scenario. So that's the plan. I want to dive straight in. So first, how did growth become the priority that it is today? Because what's so interesting is that although it sits at the center of our common life together, before the 1950s, essentially nobody was talking about the idea of economic growth. No politicians, no policymakers, no economists. And this is what this Google Ngram for economic growth shows, that before 1950, there's almost no mention of economic growth in print publications. Now, that only changes in the Second World War. One of the basic questions when you're waging war is how much of the economic pie can you slice up and dedicate to the war effort, and how much can you keep back for civilian needs? And this was the question that confronted policymakers in the 1940s. And what was fascinating was that until the 1940s, there was no reliable way of even knowing how large the economy was, whether it was growing, and if so, by how much. Those policymakers couldn't answer that question of how much they could dedicate to the war effort. And so in stepped this man, the great British economist John Maynard Keynes, who developed the essentially world's first formal measure alongside an American economist called Simon Kuznets of how large the economy actually was, a measure that would become known in the 1990s as gross domestic product, or GDP. Now, that's the first part in the story of how growth became such a priority. But the key thing here is that GDP is just a static snapshot of how big the economy is at any moment in time. The growth priority, this idea that we ought to pursue more and more growth, that's about ever increasing the amount of GDP. So how did this idea that we ought to relentlessly pursue ever more GDP become such a priority? Well, the answer to that question is, again, war, albeit war of a different type. So as the hot war of the Second World War comes to an end, the Cold War begins. And one of the interesting things about the Cold War, of course, is that it was very difficult to tell who was winning. Many of the traditional measures of who's winning a conflict, soldiers killed, weapons destroyed, territory won and lost, those weren't available. This was a Cold War. And what happened, in effect, was that the relative size of, in particular, the US and the Soviet economies became a proxy for who was winning the war. A period of so-called growthmanship began between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, in part, what drove this was a fear that in the event that the Cold War would eventually ever turn hot, the country with a larger economy would be the one that would be able to fund the larger military. But it was also, of course, a battle of ideas between two very different conceptions of how to organize economic and social life. Capitalism in the United States and the market, socialism and central planning in the Soviet Union. So you have, in the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy saying capitalism and growth will be the thing that helps people sitting on the razor edge of decision between them and us choose the capitalist system. Nikita Khrushchev on the other side talks about how growth is going to be the battering ram with which we will smash the capitalist system. So what's interesting then is, as the Cold War gradually fades away and the 20th century unfolds, it turns out that economic growth, this thing that was only ever a means to telling how large the economy was during the Second World War, telling who was winning the Cold War, it turns out that growth is associated with almost every measure of human flourishing. Economies that grow more tend to have populations that, as before, live longer, healthier lives. They can fund better healthcare systems, better education systems. They can fund all the sorts of research and development that thrusts our economies forward. And so as the 20th century unfolds, this growth priority stubbornly remains behind. There never was a moment where teams of smart people sitting somewhere in a central government office said, let's pursue growth. This is something that we ought to pursue. It kind of gets there by accident, and it remains there. So how should we respond then to the growth dilemma that this pursuit of growth has left us with? On the one hand, it's associated with almost every measure of human flourishing, but on the other hand, it's associated with many of the greatest challenges that we face as well. And I think it's clear we cannot continue as we have in the past. So the question then is, should we simply slow down the growth of our economies or even shrink them? And this is the demand that the so-called degrowth movement is famous for supposedly making. If growth is the problem, then less growth seems to be their solution, and more specifically, negative GDP growth. So I think it's really important to explore this idea. To begin with, the idea is increasingly influential. So interest in it might have begun among a small group of, ecologically minded academics, but it's spread far and wide. So you now have politicians like Caroline Lucas, environmentalists like David Attenborough, activists like Greta Thunberg, all appealing in different ways to this idea of degrowth. And in turn, I think this is really important as well, the confusions involved in the degrowth discussion often turn out to be useful. Many of them reflect fundamental misunderstandings about the causes of growth. And it's helpful to understand them if we're going to sidestep similar mistakes in thinking about how we respond to the growth dilemma. So what actually is degrowth? What does it actually mean? One of the great frustrations is that when you look a little closer at the idea, it turns out it's very hard to tell. Even people within the field disagree a huge amount about exactly what it is this word means. So I think a useful starting point is to look at how the idea is actually used in practice by its supporters. And when you do this, what you see is that there's two related schools of thought. And I think the best articulation of this degrowth diagnosis is of what's wrong with the world was articulated by Greta Thunberg at the 2019 United Nations Climate Action Summit, when she stood up and she said to the assembled room, "My message is we will be watching you. You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" So I think the first part of this is fundamentally right. It's another way of saying, albeit more rhetorically, that our current growth path is unsustainable. I think, if we're thinking about degrowth as a diagnosis of what's gone wrong in our world, I think this is bang on. In fact, I think environmentalists who typically make these sorts of arguments are probably underestimating the true price of growth. It's not simply that growth destroys the climate, but it's also, as I mentioned before, driving greater inequalities in society. It's undermining the availability of good work. It's threatening how well our political systems function, and it's disrupting the health of particular places and communities. But there's another part to this idea of degrowth being a sort of diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world, which is this more provocative claim, which is the idea of continued growth in the first place is just infeasible. And this belief that Greta is appealing to here has appeared in various forms over time, but it's gradually been sort of standardized and sanded down into a popular slogan that you might have heard, that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet. Lots of people say it, but this part of the diagnosis, unlike that first part, which is we cannot continue as we have in the past, this part, that infinite growth is not possible on a finite planet, this is just wrong. Infinite growth is possible on a finite planet, and this is very important. A big part of the problem with this idea of infinite growth not being possible on a finite planet is that this idea of a finite planet is rooted in a very old-fashioned view of economic activity. And the origins of this disposition, I think, are understandable. So when the founding fathers of the discipline of economics were working in the 18th and 19th century, people like Malthus, Ricardo, Mill, Marx, Adam Smith, in whose name tonight's lecture is taking place, when they were working in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British economy was overwhelmingly made up of farms and factories. So, people worked with their hands, and inputs into production and out of production could readily be counted. And it's true that in a solely material world, there's obvious physical limits on how much economic activity can take place. There's only so many acres of land that can be farmed. There's only so much raw material for production. But focusing on this material world distracts us from how growth actually works. So growth does not come from using more and more finite resources, as many tend to assume, more land, more people, more raw materials, and so on. That's not where growth comes from. Growth comes from discovering ever more productive ways of combining our finite resources. In other words, economic growth comes from technological progress. So another way to put this is, another way to think about this is that growth doesn't come from the world of tangible objects, the things that we can see and touch around us and drop on our feet. But growth comes from the intangible world of ideas. So what do I mean by ideas? I mean recipes or instructions for organizing all the atoms in the world, or more prosaically, recipes or instructions for making more productive use of the finite resources that we have. And the key point for us in thinking about what causes growth is that whereas the planet of tangible resources might be finite, as the degrowthers rightly say, the universe of those intangible ideas, it's unimaginably vast, for all intents and purposes, as good as infinite. So just to really hammer this point home, I want you to think of a kitchen larder. And I want you to imagine that this larder has 300 ingredients in it. So it's got finite ingredients in it. The key point for us is that there are more possible recipes for combining those 300 ingredients than there are atoms in the universe. And exactly the same argument applies for us when we're thinking about economic growth, where we're not dealing with 300 ingredients in a larder, but we're dealing quite literally with all the resources that we have in the world. I think so there's this, when we think of degrowth as being a diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world, I think it gets right, this idea that we cannot continue as we have in the past. I think it gets wrong this very fundamental idea, though, about how it is that growth actually works. But the deeper problem with degrowth is when you take it not as a diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world, but as a solution to what's gone wrong in the world. The idea that we ought to just press pause on growth or even go into reverse. And when you take that idea seriously, so let's just take it seriously for a moment. Let's imagine we freeze global GDP per capita at its current level, but you find abandoning 800 million people to extreme poverty forever, which is what that would require if we were to freeze global GDP at its current levels. If you find that idea unacceptable, leaving 800 million people in extreme poverty, the only alternative that you have if you want to do something that resembles degrowth in practice is slash the income of the 7.1 billion people that remain, including practically all of the Western population. It's an idea that is just both morally and practically, it seems to me, reprehensible. And the deeper point here, when we think about the future, is that economic growth has been revolutionary in many ways, and it's improved our lives in so many different dimensions. But it's also just fundamentally an unfinished revolution. And I think this is what the degrowth movement at a deeper level all too often fails to appreciate. It's just so extraordinarily unimaginative to think that our current economic lot is the best that we can ever do, and that we ought to press pause on growth, not simply for now or the next 10 or 100 years, but for all time to come. So my starting point is that we do need more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, it would be a catastrophe. And so the question for us, and the question that is, racking the brains of politicians and policymakers at the moment, is how on earth do you get more growth? And what's interesting is that although politicians and policymakers talk very confidently about the causes of economic growth, actually we know surprisingly little about the causes of economic growth. Are one of the great mysteries of economic thought. I thought Elhanan Helpman, the great economist, put it very well. He said, for centuries, economists have been preoccupied with the growth of nations, but the subject has proved elusive and many mysteries remain. We know surprisingly little about how we get more growth. That said, I do think there is one lesson that we can take from this sort of fog of uncertainty about what causes growth. And it's this, which is that if we want more growth, what we need, as I said before, is that we need more technological progress. And if we want more technological progress, what we need are more ideas about the world, ever more creative, ingenious, inventive ideas for how we can put our finite resources to use. In other words, the question, how do we get more growth, really is a question, how do we generate more ideas in society? And it seems to me that the answer to that question leads us to four different policy areas, four different things we can do. The first is that we need to radically rethink the intellectual property regime, the laws and regulations that shape how ideas are used and reused in society. The second is that we need to invest vastly more in research and development. We cannot expect a steady stream of new ideas about the world unless we invest seriously in their discovery. The third is that we need to get more people into the parts of the economy that are actually responsible for generating new ideas. And the final and perhaps most radical one is that we need to use some of these new technologies themselves to help us generate new ideas about the world. And I just want now just to give you a flavor of a couple of these, just so you have a sense of what it is that I think we need to be exploring. So first, think about research and development. Here are R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP with various countries around the world. You can see at the front, Israel, Korea, Taiwan investing over 5, over 4, over 3% of their GDP per year in research and development. Israel at the vanguard, the United States some distance behind. This is the OECD average, collection of advanced countries, their average. This is Britain sitting well below that. We cannot expect as a country a steady stream of new, inventive, ingenious, creative ideas about the world unless we take seriously investment in their discovery, which I don't think we currently do. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that when you then look at the country at the vanguard, Israel, and look at the 5.4% that they invest, and then compare that to what large technology companies invest as a percentage of their revenue in R&D. Now, of course, a company isn't a country, but it gives you a flavor, gives you a sense of what it would look like to really take research and development seriously. So Israel invests the most of any country, but then look at the technology companies. Alphabet invests 15.1% of its revenue in research and development, Huawei 15.9%, Microsoft 13%, Facebook 21%. Again, we cannot expect serious ideas about the world unless we invest in their discovery. A very different strategy, though, is to use these technologies themselves that we're developing to help us generate ideas about the world. And this, I think, is the most radical, but also in a way, perhaps the most promising path that we have. We have become very used to the idea that the best ideas about the world come from the heads of intelligent human beings. That was the story in the 20th century. And the way in which many economies grew in the 20th century was by getting more and more people into ever more advanced levels of education. I think in the 21st century, the best ideas about the world are going to come less and less from us, and they're going to come more and more from the technologies we build instead. And that is going to be the origin of prosperity in the 21st century. In the 20th century, growth came from a country's willingness to invest in its human capital, in the skills and capabilities of its people. In the 21st century, I think more and more growth is going to come from countries that are willing to invest in these technologies instead. Now, this idea that ideas might come from these technologies instead might sound a bit odd, but we can already catch a glimpse of it already. So, during the pandemic, Moderna gave us a glimpse of this. They used AI to help them develop their COVID-19 vaccine. And now artificially intelligent or technology-based medicine development is, it's pretty widespread. I think the more sort of interesting example of this, though, is a more recent one. And it's a system called AlphaFold. This is AlphaFold 1, but it's actually AlphaFold 2 that I have in mind. So this was a system that was developed by an artificial intelligence company called DeepMind, based in London, owned by Google. In 2020, this system essentially solved what's known as the protein folding problem. So the protein folding problem is a problem in biology, which is that there are millions of proteins out there. If we want to understand how these proteins work, and we want to develop medicines and treatments to deal with the diseases caused by these proteins, we have to know the 3D shape of these proteins. Knowing the 3D shape of proteins is incredibly important for developing medicine and responding to diseases. The problem, though, is that figuring out the 3D shape of a protein is an immensely difficult task. We can get a kind of two-dimensional picture of proteins, but understanding their three-dimensional shape is very, very difficult. Just to give you a flavor of quite how difficult, it's said that it would take a good PhD student in biology their entire PhD to figure out the shape of just one of these proteins. And until recently, we knew something like 10 or 15% of the shape of these 3D proteins. And again, knowing the 3D shape of these proteins is crucial if we want to understand how diseases work and treat them effectively. DeepMind with AlphaFold came along and essentially solved the protein folding problem. It calculated the 3D structure of every protein and made them available open source for researchers and scientists to use. From a kind of practical point of view, this is just going to transform our understanding of disease and medicine in years to come. What, of course, is interesting is that last year, Demis Hassabis, the co-founder of DeepMind and one of the lead architects of the system, won the Nobel Prize in chemistry for developing this system. But it always seemed to me that that was perhaps, it was right that Demis won it, but in a way, this system should have won it as well. And I think it was a glimpse of something that we are going to see far more of in years to come. The best and most powerful, most transformative ideas we have about the world are going to come from technologies like this rather than from smart human beings. And I think that's going to have really important implications for thinking about growth in the next 100 years compared to growth in the last 100 years. So my view is that we need more growth. If growth were to fizzle out, as I said at the start, it would just be a catastrophe. But again, the growth dilemma can't be solved by that alone. It's only going to be made worse if we just plow on in pursuit of more growth and ignore the tremendous price associated with growth as well. So it seems to me that we have to use every tool in our disposal, not simply to generate more growth, but to generate a different type of growth as well. Now, what does that look like in practice? I think a really good example of what it looks like to change the nature of growth in society is to think about one particular dimension of the price of growth, which is this idea that it destroys the climate as before. So I want to take you back to 2007, which was when the UK government published the Stern Review, written by Sir Nicholas Stern. It was the first report of its kind into the economics of climate change. 700-page report. One of the central conclusions in this report was that if we wanted to reduce emissions by 80%, we would have to pay a price of 1% of GDP a year in order to reduce emissions by 80%. In other words, there was a really kind of strong trade-off between growth and the climate. If we wanted to protect the climate, we had to pay a serious price, 1% of growth per year. The next year, Nicholas Stern came forward and said, no, I got it wrong, actually. Climate change is worse than I thought. If we want to reduce emissions by 80%, we're going to have to cut GDP by 2% a year. Climate change, in his view, had sped up. The problem had got worse. Fast forward, though, to the year 2020 and have a look at the work done by the UK Climate Change Committee, who were the team of experts tasked with advising the British government at the time on the challenge of climate change. They found that the cost of eliminating emissions, so not simply reducing them by 80%, but completely eliminating them, had fallen to just 0.5% of GDP per year. In other words, that trade-off between growth and the climate, growth and the environment, had dramatically improved. You only had to give up 0.5% of GDP per year if you wanted to protect the climate. You had to give up far less growth than was feared just 15 years ago to protect the climate. And the big question for us is why? What happened between 2007 and now that meant you needed to pay a lower price in terms of growth to protect the climate? And the answer to that question is because technological progress, particularly in renewable energy, meant it was possible to grow the economy while not causing as much harm to the environment. More specifically, essentially 2 decades of interventions, taxes and subsidies, rules and regulations, social norms and customs, just completely transformed the incentives that we all face in society, so that entrepreneurs and innovators were encouraged not just to develop new technologies, which, as I said, that's the stuff that really drives economic growth, but to develop particular types of technologies, namely those that did less harm to the environment, and in turn, for us all to adopt them. So the result was not simply a technological revolution, but it was a green technological revolution. And I think the best example of this is what happened with solar energy over the last few decades. So solar energy begins in the 1970s really as a tool of last resort. So if you want to generate electricity in outer space or in an isolated lighthouse, you use a solar panel. And yet today, solar panels are completely widespread. Why did that happen? Well, it's because there was an exponential, just a precipitous collapse in the cost of solar modules. So from something like $100 per watt in 1976 to less than $0.50 per watt by 2019. And that drove an explosive and exponential increase in their use as well. So the practical result of this has been that growth around the world is greener than ever. More and more countries are able to grow while reducing their emissions at the same time. And that's what each of these little charts shows. A country growing, that top line, while reducing its emissions in absolute terms, that bottom line at the same time. This was simply inconceivable back in 2007 when people were thinking about the economics of climate change. Now think about another dimension of the price of growth, just to see how this might apply in other settings. The idea that these technologies might, the technologies associated with increasing economic growth might also undermine the availability of good work. Every year since 1981, if we think about the United States, the effective tax rate that business leaders in the United States have had to pay to hire workers has been far higher than using machines. In other words, the tax system in the United States for almost half a century has created a very strong incentive to develop a particular type of technology, namely technologies that replace workers at work rather than make them more productive at work, rather than make them better at their jobs. And you might say, well, given that, surely we ought to try and change those incentives. We ought to think about how we could use the tax system, not just the United States, but around the world, to encourage people not just to develop new technologies, which again is the stuff that drives economic growth, but to develop technologies that help people in their work rather than harm them, that create more jobs rather than destroy jobs. And the argument I make in my work is that this is what we need to do systematically when we're thinking about all the different dimensions in which growth has a price. We need to go through each of them and ask, how can we change the incentives in society so that we encourage people to develop technologies that, yes, make us more prosperous, but also don't damage these other things that we value and care about. Now, you might say that's too ambitious, the idea that we can use incentives in this way to change the nature of growth. I think a good example, though, of quite how powerful incentives can be happened during the pandemic. This was a really good example of economic incentives in action. So think about what happened during the pandemic. Practically overnight, billions of people around the world woke up and found themselves unable to go to work. And from an economic point of view, essentially what that meant was that the price of work essentially went to infinity. For many workers, there was, for reasons of law and regulation, there was no wage you could pay to get them into the workplace. The price of labor became incredibly expensive. No matter how much you offered to pay people, they couldn't go into work, not only because it was dangerous again, but because the law prohibited it. And so if we're thinking about the idea of changing the nature of technological progress, this catastrophe that we went through is really revealing, because one of the first effects of these infinite wages was that it drove employees and employers to rapidly adopt technologies that allowed people to work remotely, things like Zoom, Teams, Skype, and so on. And this figure captures the transformation that happened in the United States. So before the pandemic, the percentage of paid full days work from home in the United States was about 5%. At the peak of the pandemic, it soared to about 60%, so sort of 12-fold increase in remote working. And it's stabilized since then, in the years since then, at about 30%. So in other words, what happened during the pandemic was that this extraordinary incentive that the pandemic created, this sort of infinite wage associated with work, led to a 12-fold increase in remote working in the beginning, and now a more permanent 6-fold increase in the use of remote work. And what we've seen in other countries is a very similar story unfolding. And I can bet you, in the absence of that incentive, it would have taken decades for those sorts of remote working technologies to be adopted, if they would have been adopted at all. Now, what's interesting, of course, about those remote working technologies is that none of them were new. Zoom, Skype, Teams, they were all around before the pandemic began. What this incentive did was that it encouraged the uptake of existing technologies. But it also, and this was the second effect, led to the development of new technologies as well. And that example that I mentioned of the COVID-19 vaccine is a really good example of this. So at the start of the pandemic, I was working on vaccine policy, as many economists were at the time, and the conventional wisdom that we were told was that it would take a decade or more to get one vaccine. And yet in practice, what we had was 3 within 9 months. And it was the consequence of this extraordinary incentive that led to the creation of these new technologies. So my theme that runs through my work, and the theme that I want to leave you with this evening, is not to underestimate the power of incentives to shape or to direct the sorts of technologies that we develop in society, and in turn, the nature of the economic growth that we enjoy as a result. we can change these incentives, we can change the sorts of technologies that get developed, and we can change the type of growth that we enjoy as well, if we want to. And so we ought to use, again, every tool in our disposal to change the nature of growth. Taxes and subsidies, laws and regulations, social norms and customs, and make that growth less destructive of things that we care about: a better environment, a more equal society, the availability of good work, a healthier politics, flourishing local places and communities. And in my work, I explore exactly how to do that. But I also think, in the end, we have to accept we might not always be able to do this, and particularly in the shorter run. And the final task we have is to ask, I think, the hardest question of all, which is, are we willing to sacrifice growth in order to protect those other important outcomes that we care about? Are we willing to pay a price in terms of growth to protect other things that we think are valuable and important in society? Now, there are many people, and if there are any economists in the room, they will be familiar with this, who say, look, the way to respond to this challenge, Daniel, is, look, we just need to revise the GDP measure. What we need to do is we need to capture other valuable things that we care about as a society: the state of the environment, the level of inequality in society. And we ought to try and bundle these things into a sort of more perfect GDP measure, a sort of GDP plus. And we ought to pursue that instead. And I think this is a big mistake. And it's important because this is a direction, as I said, that many economists and policymakers are going in at the moment, but I think it's a mistake. And the reason I think it's a mistake is because this question about what we ought to value, if not growth, and how much we ought to value it, those are not technical questions about mismeasurement, but they're moral questions about what really matters. They're not questions for economists and statisticians and technocrats to answer, but they're questions for citizens to answer. And my view is that these questions about what we ought to value, if not growth, and how much we ought to value them, they are some of the hardest questions we can ask. And they're going to invite, and they do invite, immense disagreement. And the place for resolving that disagreement is not in treasuries and statistical departments, but it's in politics and it's among citizens. So I think what we need to do in order to engage with these moral questions is not revise technical measures like GDP, but support political innovation that allows citizens to come together, a new wave of institutions that brings citizens together to debate important issues like this again and again. And I think we can already catch an encouraging glimpse of what this would look like in practice: so-called mini publics, things like citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, citizens' panels. They're on the rise in OECD countries over the last few decades. In various ways, they bring together citizens to debate some of the hardest questions you can ask in some of the hardest places you can ask them. Abortion in Ireland, euthanasia in France. And I think this is what we need more and more of to engage with some of these tricky moral questions. Again, these are not questions to be answered by statisticians and economists and technocrats, but they're for citizens to answer instead. So I want to just close in the last minute or two on a note of optimism. Because as I think about the future, I am hopeful. And I know that we live in an age of anxiety where almost every day it feels like we are reminded of various existential risks that we face and our supposed incapacity to deal with them. But the argument I really want you to take away from this evening is an optimistic one, that we also have, in a sense, an existential opportunity in front of us as well. What I hope I've done is describe an opportunity for moral renewal, a way for us to pay more attention to other valuable ends that we might have neglected until now. And that we can do so from a position of strength. Now, remember, looking out into the future, far more technologically capable and materially prosperous than any moment in our 300,000-year history. There's a line that I love from the great late philosopher Derek Parfit when he says, we have the power not just to make life good in decades to come, but to make it better in ways that we now cannot even imagine. Nothing in my view could be more important than that. And that, I hope, is what this evening has been all about. So thank you very much indeed. And I look forward now to hearing some reflections of that. I think we've got a few. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, for superb talk. We've got two people. I hope a second one is going to appear who's going to take a microphone. Right. Thanks, Grant.
Really as well as you say who you are and where you're from.
Yeah. As before, please make sure if you've got the microphone, you hold it like this rather than like this, because they are very directional. So there's a microphone at the back, a microphone at the front. Please keep your question concise if you can, to allow plenty of people to have their say. So if we've got some questions. Yes. Right, getting ready down. Yes, up, thank you to the back, Adrian, yeah. There's one at the front. We'll get the microphone to you in a minute. Yes. Right. No, you might need to put the. Is your microphone on? Right.
Francis, I'm interested in the account of the specific example, but my question actually goes to your optimism at the end. You questioned whether people are prepared to give up growth for an idea, and I wondered what your reflection on the evidence that we have of people choosing Brexit.
Well, no, I think it's a really good example. And not simply, and I write about this in the book, I mean, it's not simply Brexit. I also think it's a way of thinking about President Trump and his approach to tariffs. Both of those are examples of a tension between growth through growth globalization and the promise of what that means in terms of increasing our collective prosperity, but also that entails a price, not only an economic price on particular industries, which, in many cases are sort of decimated by globalization, but also the communities and places around those industries where people get a strong sense of meaning and identity from that work and that industry. And I think it's a really good example of confronting the trade-off and saying, Brexit is an example where we have paid an economic price to protect those other things that people think are valuable and important. I don't think it was framed like that. That's in practice. Similarly, in the United States, I don't think the US administration would say that paying an economic price in terms of the tax, they wouldn't admit that. But that is what is happening in practice. A price is being paid in terms of growth and globalization and trade to protect particular industries and particular communities, the source of shared identity and build that around. I think it's a really good example of this dilemma, this tension between the pursuit of growth and material prosperity that brings and a price that it imposes in particular places and communities. So I think this is a really useful framing to think about exactly what the point I want to make is that that question about whether or not it is the right balance is struck, that the trade-off was correct, that is not a question for economists and statisticians to answer. It's a question that ought to be answered in politics. And I would argue, for instance, that a referendum was a blunt way of engaging citizens in this very political, moral piece of deliberation. And we also have had more of sort of citizen debate and disagreement that and I rather than less.
One down at the front here, yes.
Sure.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Daniel Susskind, sort of investment management consultant. Basically, and consolidate everything you have said tonight. What should the audience be taking away from that?
Well, I think the main piece of the main thing to take away really is the theme that I was trying to set out on that final slide. That we face extraordinary challenges and we live in a very anxious time. And yet, in spite of that, I still think we have an extraordinary opportunity in front of us as well. And that when you step out and put our moment in the context of this extraordinary, human story, 300,000 years of stagnation, in a literal blink of an eye, our economies and lives have been transformed. It is a moment that is filled with far more possibility than I think many people currently feel or imagine. Well, that's the spirit of hopefully that's the spirit of what I've said.
Thank you. Up at the back.
Hi, I'm a government professor from the US. I was hoping you could talk more about productivity.
Right.
We were taught, at least in the US, that you measure productivity in terms of making more goods more quickly. And that despite the internet and interconnectedness and working 24/7 and email and all of that, services being provided faster does not boost productivity. What about something like AlphaFold, right? Now, if we know all the protein, three-dimensional compounds, etc., presumably we can go about making many more medicines. Anything more to say about productivity and whether these technological innovations are boosting productivity?
Yeah. The productivity is at the heart of this story. That distinction I made between growth coming from simply using more resources, which is not right, to growth coming from making ever more productive use of resources, that is where growth comes from. Growth comes from productivity increases. Productivity increases come from technological progress. Technological progress comes from discovering new ideas about the world. And so the hope, exactly as you said, is that the sorts of technologies we are developing at the moment will deliver the sort of productivity that economies around the world desperately need at the moment. There's various challenges, issues with this, though. One is that many of the things that are transforming our lives are very, very difficult to capture in productivity statistics. Many of the things and particularly many things that rely on technology, many things that are free, many things that have changing quality, very hard to capture in productivity statistics. Another issue is that, if we look at history, so it's quite difficult to know actually what's going on with productivity. It feels like our lives are saturated by these extraordinary technologies, and yet the measured productivity statistics don't seem to change that much. The other thing to say is that if you look at moments in history, productivity has often followed moments of extraordinary technological progress with an extreme lag. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution, this kind of comparable moment of extraordinary technological innovation, spinning jenny, the roller spinner, power looms, steam engines, all of this. And yet it takes almost a century for it to start appearing in productivity statistics. It takes a long time for these technologies to kind of diffuse through the economy. So it's not a done deal that the sorts of technologies I'm describing feed into either measured productivity or actual productivity. But that's certainly the aspiration. That's certainly the hope that many people. And I would say that one of the big challenges, one of the big issues with, and we can perhaps talk about this in other questions maybe, one of the issues with the way the British government is currently approaching their growth strategy is that it is not sufficiently focused on discovering new ideas about the world, innovation, technological progress, productivity. It's far more focused on old-fashioned ideas about what causes growth, that growth comes from doing big, impressive things in the material world, building more houses, building, wider roads, building longer bridges. That sort of stuff's not going to harm growth. But if you really want serious economic growth, it comes from a very different place. It seems to me it comes from those sort of policy areas that I set out before.
Down at the front here,
Yes, hello. Bruce Wilkinson, the United Nations Institutional Officer at Glasgow. Why would those very few, very rich individuals who own the means of production want to share that increasing wealth with citizens, and all they need is artificial intelligence to make more money?
Why would they?
Yes, why would they do what's the incentive to share the wealth with citizens, which I think is part of your premise?
Well, no, I mean, I'm grateful we have a state, because the purpose of the state is, to tax and to distribute prosperity that comes from these extraordinary technologies. One of the great challenges, and I haven't spoken about it today, but one of the great challenges is that these technologies, like artificial intelligence, make us collectively prosperous, in the sense that, GDP, the size of the economy, GDP per capita, the amount of the economy, if you divide it up into equal slices for everyone in the world, that's really growing. But it's undermining, at the same time, our traditional way of sharing out this prosperity. Either the way you're describing, which is that there's a tendency towards greater wealth inequality, that a smaller number of people have a greater share of these extraordinarily valuable technologies. But it's also happening in other ways as well. The fact that, many people who rely on their work for income, the vast majority of us, that these technologies are, if you worry about things like technological unemployment, that these technologies might undermine the availability of good work. Well, in that way, it's undermining the traditional way in which we've shared out this prosperity, which is by paying people for work for the jobs that they do. So I think one of the big challenges that we face as these technologies become more and more capable, and it's the challenge that I set out and I haven't spoken about, which is that these technologies are associated with lots of inequality. It's how we solve this distribution problem. How do we share out this extraordinary prosperity in society when our traditional way of doing so, paying people for the work that they do, might be less effective than and I think relying on the benevolence of the people who are responsible for developing the technology is not a good approach. And that is why, I think thinking seriously about what taxation system looks at in the 21st century and how we share the extraordinary prosperity these technologies created is really very important. But I think this issue of inequality is exactly right. It's not just wealth inequality. It's happening in lots of different dimensions.
National taxation and global economy.
Well, this is, the idea that we need a sort of a global tax of some kind is an idea that many economists who are alarmed by these trends have appealed to. So the French economist Thomas Piketty, whose book Capital was a sort of multi-million bestseller a few years ago, had one central policy recommendation, which of course exactly as you say, global wealth. I feel that that's the only way to respond to these extraordinary concentrations of what society these technologies have created.
Thank you. Thank you. And up at the back, yes.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Rowe. My background is music and literature.
Yes.
Thank you for your stimulating talk. I'm thinking of your graph with the horizontal, more or less horizontal line for nearly 300,000 years, followed by the almost vertical line of the last 250.
Yeah.
And my question is about particularly point out in it. You were told recently that we're nearing one of the environmental tipping points, and I'm just wondering what happens to the new, different kind of growth model once we've reached a point where we might lose control, we might be collapse of ecological systems.
Yeah. So my view on, and I sort of set it out in my talk really, is that fundamentally I see the challenge of climate change as a technological challenge. We have made immense progress in the last 15, 20 years in developing technologies that allow us to grow while at the same time doing less damage to the environment in a way that I think the environmental movement still hasn't really accepted and confronted. I think we need more of that. So I see the challenge as being fundamentally a technological one about how we develop and encourage the development of technologies that will allow us to continue to grow while also protecting the environment. So, I mean, I think it's a very difficult task. I don't want to be, it's incredibly difficult task, and the politics of doing that are, seem sort of insurmountable. But what I put back to those who say the only thing we can do is press pause on growth or go into reverse is that the starkness of what that would entail, which is slashing the income of 7.1 billion people in the Western world, and practically the entire Western population. I mean, just look at the kind of convulsions of anger, discontent, and political polarization that emerge when growth simply slows down, as it has over the last few years. The idea that we can actively reduce people's incomes in the developed countries is just, it's even more fascinating. So for me, the way in which we resolve this tension between growth and climate is through technology, rather than trying to press forward to go into reverse. Again, it's not an easy challenge, but I think it is the more feasible than the alternative, which seems to be trying to press things to go into reverse.
Yes, one down at the front here.
Muslims, as a business school, I work as a psychologist. I was studying trust in organizations and institutions, and I just completed 4 studies across different nations to do with elections. So I'm curious to find out how politics is the solution when the evidence that we have from recent elections shows the polarity and the amount of distrust of people who have lost that election, and that the incoming institutions and political leaders are not to be trusted forward. So if politics is the solution, they have to decide what is.
Yeah, so that is a different conception of what we mean by politics. I mean, for me, when I write about politics as a solution, I don't tend to have in mind the kind of traditional politicians in great chains of state. What I have in mind is a very different participative type of politics, where those sorts of inequalities that I described, I think, set out apart from what that might look like. The sort of politics without the politics. serious prospect here. And what's interesting, of course, about it is that when you look in practice, you used it in really interesting ways. So various populations out of environments, and yeah, I think one of the most interesting ways in which citizen assembly has been used was in Korea 5 or 6 years ago. So after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, there was in that part of the world, and Europe, sort of withdrawing from the idea that we ought to use nuclear power. But anyone who spent their time looking at how we resolve this tension between growth and climate knows it's not going to be done without making nuclear an important part of your energy. It's can't grow and also technically we want. And so Korea, the political leadership in Korea, were following because they committed in the aftermath of this disaster to retreat from nuclear energy, yet at the same time, they also knew they didn't want nuclear energy. So they formed the citizen assembly. I can't remember the details, but I think it was a pretty sophisticated one. So people chose to focus by a jury system that was piled up and they deliberated for a long period. And citizens were briefed by experts and politicians and policymakers and all the people involved, the stakeholders involved. And the conclusion of the citizen assembly was exactly that. Yes, nuclear energy would have to be part of the energy, but there was no way to reconcile this energy that we were required without nuclear energy. So what was interesting was that the outcome of this participants in the process created a new sort of political path for those traditional politicians today. And that's what I want to see far more about this programs. And what worries is that we don't see that sort of participation in these programs. Brexit was mentioned before, the sort of participative process that I think we all had without. I think there is an issue at the moment in Britain. There is a large political constituency of people who think that the pursuit of net zero is a bad idea. And as the government continues to pursue net zero, those people are just going to become more and more alienated from that position. It seems to me that that is another example of a policy history that was not a technical one, fundamentally moral, and there should be far more participants in politics around that to engage everyone. I mean, this is the direction that our country is going to go. We are willing to pay a price in the short term in order to protect the climate from sitting at zero. So the sort of headline answer to you is when I talk about politics, I mean something slightly different from what many people have in mind.
So there's one at the back, yes. For Zoom, we need to have your microphone first. Yes.
Exactly, as you know, the Mercers I was just going to focus on how there's a current such a higher reliance in AI more than academia. In my class, I've seen the multiple measures put in place to try and minimize the use of AI. What's your thoughts on the mass use of AI software in academia, particularly the university students when doing this assignments and examinations?
Yeah.
And do you have any fears that are relying on automated assessments?
Yeah. So I mean, it's such an important question, and this really is what my new book is all about. It's called What Should My Children Do? How to Flourish in the Age of AI. And one of the big questions that I'm grappling with is what's the role of AI in education? And my view is that the sort of hostility that many educational institutions have at the moment towards AI is just, it is hopelessly misplaced. It's hopelessly misplaced from a sort of practical point of view, which is that I think the starting point of any educational institution should be every single student in this classroom is using this technology. What does that therefore mean for what I teach and how I teach? Rather than asking, how do I stop my students from using it? So let's take her question. Let's just hold on. Let me answer, and let's take your question after, because I think it's an important one. So So it's practically just infeasible, but it's also, again, just imaginatively, staggeringly unimaginative that students can now use these technologies to solve problems, write text, just do things that was simply unimaginable to a previous generation. But so my argument is that, look, we need to do both. We need to make sure that we are teaching the next generation to use these technologies and use them effectively, exactly as that person said. These technologies, while they are extraordinarily capable, are also in many ways remarkably flawed. And we need to be making sure that people using these technologies understand that. They understand both their strengths and their weaknesses. And that is a really important task of schools and universities and professional institutions now, to make sure that people not simply use these technologies, but are able to make effective use of these technologies. But at the same time, we've also got to make sure that we are still teaching people how to flourish without the technologies as well. Making sure that basic literacy, basic numeracy, basic problem solving isn't dwindling and falling away as the use of these technologies become more and more frequent. So I think we have to, in every part of education, my mantra is that we need to teach both and we need to test both. Teach both how to use these technologies effectively and also teach how not to use them. Because, the truth is that when you leave university and go into the world, your life is going to be saturated with these technologies, and we are letting down the next generation if we're not preparing them to use them effectively. That's my view on that.
Was there a supplementary, I think, was there a supplementary?
I'd be interested to know if the person asking the question was themselves involved in education. Yeah. Go on, yes, please. So tell me who you are and what you. Yeah.
That cannot be relied upon.
Yes.
And because of that, I think if you're teaching students to use the AI,
yes,
that are unreliable.
Yes. It's such an important, because you're absolutely right, which is that these technologies are unreliable, and they are going to be unreliable. I think, there are optimistic engineers out there who say, we'll iron out all the problems. Nonsense. These technologies are going to have their problems for some time to come. Also extraordinarily powerful. And the role of education is to teach the next generation to use these technologies, not simply use them blindly or use them unthinkingly or use them uncritically, but use them effectively, to be able to understand what the idea of a hallucination is, to be able to understand the mistakes that they made. And I think it's just, we will be letting down the next generation. And this is, I think it really is one of the great challenges of the moment.
Well, thank you.
But it sounds exactly like you are an ideal pupil for one of the classes that I have in mind, because this is precisely what I think we need to be teaching the next generation to do.
The question in the middle.
I believe it's the incentive idea work really well, but I just think that work too well, and that will just wealthy individuals would lose money, and that would be seen as a personal degrowth that would clash with the capitalist idea of how work is the driving force for growth throughout all human history. So my question to you is, how will you propose a win-win situation for both the country and wealthy individuals to cooperate?
Yeah, I mean, so the sort of the spirit of using incentives is that you don't, and this was a question before, you don't have to rely on the benevolence of the entrepreneur or the business leader. You set the incentives in the market and they respond. And that is what has happened over the last few decades with, say, respect to the climate. I don't know what the motivations necessarily were for the people who developed solar panels. Perhaps they, perhaps they did it because they cared about the environment, but perhaps they did it because they wanted to make lots of money. But the kind of impact was the same, which was that we have had this extraordinary wave of technological progress, green technological progress, that has transformed our ability to grow without causing as much damage to the climate. And I think what we need as a society is to make sure that incentives are in place such that we can grow, but also protect other things that we care about.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Jane Ross. I've also in the past been involved in advising regional development agencies about how to measure the creative industries. So I've got a little bit of background in how complicated it is to manage there. And my question today is about what you think the political response and willingness is if the public starts to say that they are not entirely optimistic about AI, because I think a piece of research recently from Oxford, I can't remember her name, she's called Helen, and she said one was surprised.
Maybe Helen Margetts, probably.
What she did was she was really surprised with the piece of research I did recently to find that both people identified as being on the right of politics and on the left of politics both agreed that they would welcome more regulation of AI.
Yes. So can I ask you, do you know what part of the world that evidence was gathered?
No.
Okay, so one of the really interesting things is that depending where in the world you ask that question, you get very, very different views about artificial intelligence. So in the West, we tend to be in sort of, in prosperous European countries, we tend to be pretty pessimistic on average about what AI means for us. But if you go to somewhere like India and ask, what do you think about AI? People are far more optimistic about the possibilities. So it's quite interesting how very different societies have very different views about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I think, we can sort of think about why that might be. I think one of the reasons might be that people in prosperous European countries feel there's a lot to lose, whereas those in other parts of the world feel there's a tremendous amount to gain. And I suppose what I'm trying to argue is that actually even us here sitting in a prosperous European country have a tremendous amount to gain as well, if we think about and approach AI in the right way.
Time for two more questions. So one at the back.
Hi, hello. My name is Ivan. I'm a student here. In practical terms, growth is really a function of having wealth, individualistic behavior, exploitation of labor, and that's true at all scales, corporations, nations, and interpersonal relations. So I'm a bit skeptical of how having economic growth as the priority is going to end up giving us healthier communities, less unequal societies. That's my question.
So, the thesis of my work and my book is that it's absolutely possible, and I think one way to think about this is that I think a metaphor that many people have in mind when they think about economic growth is that it's almost like we're kind of society sitting in a train cabin, and we can go forward and get more of the same sort of growth, or we can push back on the throttle and get less of the same sort of growth, but our direction of travel is kind of fixed by the rails that are set down for us to trundle along. And the kind of big argument that I've been trying to make this evening is that that's the wrong metaphor. A far better metaphor is a sort of nautical one. A better way to think about the situation we're in is that we're sitting in a boat bobbing away at sea, and we can put up our sails and go faster or pull them down and go slower. But we also have a huge amount of discretion over our direction of travel as well. Not simply the amount of growth, but the nature of growth too. And so, I think that's quite an important mindset for having when we're thinking about the future. I think the issue that the environmental movement and particularly the degrowth movement often have is that sort of locomotive metaphor. We can have more growth, less growth. Growth is good, but it's more bad, so we need to pull back and slow down. And I think that's wrong. Actually, we've got a huge amount of discretion over what sort of growth we enjoy as a society too. And we've barely begun to explore those possibilities, it seems to be. Yes.
So I've got a question about language around degrowth. One of the things it seems when people talk about degrowth, they're very much talking about consumerism. What I think you've described there is productivity growth, which is a very different thing. So I'm interested in whether that framing of the language is helpful, might help that conversation. And the kicker to that is how much do you think you can have growth, particularly productivity growth, without consumerism? Because consumerism, the main driver of growth.
So I think, so in response to the first one, I think the truth is that, I don't think degrowthers even know what it is that they mean when they talk about degrowth. And that's one of the challenges, which is that for some of them, exactly as you say, it's a sense that something wrong with consumerism and we need less of that. But others have a far more, others do use the sort of language that I've been using and talk about it in a very different way. So I don't, I think it's useful to think of, if you bundle all these different accounts of degrowth together, you essentially have two different versions. You have one which sees it as a sort of diagnosis of what's gone wrong in the world, and that's the sort of Greta Thunberg story. And then you have those who think of degrowth as a sort of solution, that what we need to do is slow down or go into reverse. I think it's the most helpful way that I've found of synthesizing all these disagreements and debates and discussions. I do think you can have growth without consumerism. Again, to the point, I think you can have different types of growth. I think it's entirely feasible to conceive of a society that grows in very different ways to the way in which we currently grow today.
Really well. Thank you very much. Our time is up. I think we could go on longer. Thank you. Yes. As you know, the Society awards some medals each year, and tonight we're awarding this session's Adam Smith Medal to Professor Susskind. His personal connections to Glasgow make it actually on one level very appropriate that he be the Adam Smith Medal winner. His family come from Glasgow. A close colleague and mentor, Professor David Vines, was actually the Adam Smith Professor of Political Economy in the University of Glasgow, and he's got various other connections with Glasgow. But I think the main reason that we want to award it tonight was from the way that he's grown our minds, if you like, in the approach to perhaps questioning the assumptions that are incorrect about a whole lot of things. So I hope we take that away. Adam Smith, if we can go back to him, because I think he has got an important thing he told in The Wealth of Nations, where he said that productive labor should be made even more productive by deepening the division of labor, which with competition leads to greater productivity, and then on to inventing new ways of producing, giving lower prices and an increased standard of living, general plenty, universal opulence for all. Smith's central message was dynamic competition and was the driver of growth. And in fact, a growth machine, he said, the very topic of tonight's lecture. So would you please join with me in congratulating Professor Daniel Susskind on the Adam Smith Medal. Thank you. our lecture in 2 weeks' time here on the 29th of October, magnetizing the brain, pollution particles and Alzheimer's disease. So put that in your diary and you don't forget it from Alzheimer's. Drinks are available. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.